You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
We're going to finish the 9th chapter of Bava Batra, the chapter of inheritance. So we've dealt with transfer of property by sale, pretty much by gift. We're concluding with inheritance, and we're going to conclude the chapter with a discussion about situations where people die so suddenly that we don't know who the heir is. In other words, what assumptions do we make about ownership of property if we don't know who is alive? That's where we're going to close the discussion on inheritance. And the Mishnah begins actually with a familiar topic. This is an issue that the Mishnah discusses on many, many occasions, namely a house falling down. So clearly building standards were not, in the time of the Mishnah, building standards were not quite at the level that they are now. Because the Mishnah often talks about a building that falls down. And in this situation, in this situation, a house has fallen down on a person and on his father. So there are two people that are deceased in this collapsed building. And of course, we don't know which one deceased first. Or in the same type of situation, alav ve'al morashav, maybe on a person and on someone who was going to bequeath to him, someone from whom he would inherit. Either way, we don't know whether he's inherited because we don't know whether he was still alive when his father or when the person that was going to bequeath to him deceased. We don't know. And there are other claims on the estate. V'haita alav ketubat isha uval chov. And he was liable for his wife's ketubah. Well, obviously he's dead. His wife has the right to her ketubah. Uval chov, and there was a creditor. So there are claims on the estate. Well, what's going to happen? Yorshei ha'av. First of all, let's look at the father's heirs. This is presumably the father's other heirs. Not because the son is one of the heirs, but there must be other heirs. Yorshei ha'av omrim. The father's heirs say, Haben met Rishon. The son died first. So if he died first, he did not inherit. And afterwards the father died. That means the son has no assets. No assets for the wife and no assets for the creditors. The creditors say, Ha'av met Rishon. The creditors say the father died first. And afterwards the son died. In other words, the father died first and the son inherited. And then he died. So he essentially, the assets belong to him and his estate. What are we going to do? Because we cannot possibly establish time of death, certainly not in the time of the Mishnah. Beit Shammai omrim yacholoku. So Beit Shammai say they should just divide it up. And we've seen this before. Beit Hillel omrim. Beit Hillel say, Beit Hillel have a slightly different take. Nechasim kechez katan. The property remains in its, a chazakah could be as we assume it to exist. I've translated it here as its former status. In other words, the status of the property doesn't change. It's as it was always assumed to be, i.e., if we begin this situation with the assumption that the father owned the property, because he did. When they both walked into this house, the father owned the property. We haven't learnt anything to suggest, to prove that title had transferred to the son. So we therefore assume that the property remains with the father. That's Beit Hillel, and we can understand Beit Hillel. Let's look at another brain teaser, similar brain teaser. Nafal habayit alav ve'al ishto. This time the house has fallen down on a person and on his wife. Yorshei habal omrim, ha'isha meta rishon. The husband's heirs say The wife died first. She died first. Therefore, she has no claim on the estate. And the husband died afterwards. So the husband's heirs. Now, we're going to presume here that the husband's heirs, maybe he had brothers, maybe he has a father, maybe he has children from another marriage. Obviously, his heirs might be the wife's children, but not necessarily so. So the husband's heirs say the wife died first and the husband died afterwards. The inheritors of the wife. So this could be her children, but for example, if she's childless, or it might be her father. The wife's heirs say, Abal mate rishon v'chakach meitaki. The husband died first and the wife died afterwards. And this is a carbon copy Mishnah. Well, we can see here, right, really, how the Mishnah is taught verbally. Beit Shammai omrim. Beit Shammai say, just as they did above, Yachaloku, they should divide. Uveit Hillel omrim nechasim keches katam. The property retains its former status. At least this is how I'm phrasing the Mishnah. There's no punctuation in the Mishnah, so we have to figure this out. What is their former status? Ketubah b'cheskat yorshei habal. The ketubah goes with the husband's heirs, because the ketubah is essentially it's part of the property of the husband. The wife has a right to it, but she has a claim on it from the husband. She doesn't own the ketubah. He owns the ketubah. She has a right to it. So in other words, the ketubah, the previous state of the ketubah was with the husband. Nechasin hanichnasin veyotzin, and property that goes in and out. This is essentially her property, but her property goes to her husband. Sorry, it is her property. Nechasin hanichnasin vehayotzin. The property that goes in and out, ima, with her. In other words, it's her property going in and out of the marriage. B'cheskat yorshei ha'av, with her father's heirs. In other words, it is assumed to be her property. That's the status of that property. It's her property. And therefore, if we don't know the time of death, it reverts to her heirs, which will be essentially her father. And of course, if her father's no longer alive, the Mishnah seems to assume her father's no longer alive. It will then revert to her father's heirs. That's the second brain teaser. And then there's one more. Nafala bait alave al imo. A house fell down on a person and on his mother. Same situation. We don't know who is going to inherit. Elu va'elu modim shel yachalochu. They both agree that they should divide. Really interesting. There doesn't seem to be an argument here, and it's not quite clear why. Amar Rabbi Akiva modeani b'zeh she'anach nasim kecheskatan. Rabbi Akiva actually says, oh, look, I agree here that the property remains in its former status. I.e., he wants to take the line of Beit Hillel. Whereas in this situation, actually, it seems like Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai agree they should just split it. In other words, that the heirs of the person and the heirs of his mother, maybe she's a widow, so she might have other heirs. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai seem to agree they should divide it. And Rabbi Akiva wants to go back to the previous set of disputes. And he's criticized by his colleague Ben Azai. Amar lo Ben Azai. Ben Azai said to him, Al hachalukin anu mitzta'arin. We are distressed over the disagreements. We don't like disagreement. We don't like it. Eila shibata lachalok aleinu et hashavim. And you've come to disagree with us, or to bring us a disagreement where they agree. And Azai seems to vote for consensus and for harmony. And that's the That is how we close the chapter of inheritance. Ben Azai wants to vote for consensus and harmony, and perhaps the Mishnah implicitly recognizes the potential for family dispute that is always there when, on a time of death. And so maybe it's significant that Ben Azai says, look, we don't like disagreement. Where we can agree, we like to agree.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.